The lives of our clients have been changed by virtually every case we do in one way or another. Sometimes it's money, sometimes it's the change of a rule, sometimes it's only their day in court and a chance at justice. Americans today are beguiled by the big lie, if you will. The big lie is that America is fraught and doctors are overrun and beset with so-called frivolous medical malpractice suits. I've tried many medical malpractice cases, and I assure you that not a jury that ever left one of those, win, lose, or draw, had a suspicion or an intimation or an inkling that it was a so-called frivolous lawsuit. They don't exist. If they ever did, they don't exist in America today anymore. And people who are obliged to go to a courtroom because of a medical mistake are there today because they need to be there because of what happened to them. Our work, after all, is about justice in the courtroom and about changing the lives of every single one of our clients for the better. That's the hope, the mission that we have every time we walk into a courtroom or take a case for someone, that we're going to be able to help them and make a difference, a positive difference in their life.
Every day, somewhere in America, more than 300 innocent men, women, and children become victims of medical malpractice at the hands of incompetent and negligent doctors. Last year, over 98,000 victims were killed by doctors. More than 4 million victims are permanently injured each year.
Today, the Insider Exclusive goes behind the headlines and when doctors go wrong, getting justice in America. To examine how Victor Pribanic, founding member Pribanic Pribanic, got justice for his client in a very difficult and challenging medical malpractice case. Victor Pribanic has earned the highest respect from citizens and lawyers alike as one of the best trial lawyers in White Oak, in Pennsylvania, and in the United States. His goal is not only to get justice for his clients, but to make sure that everyone is treated with equal respect and dignity as guaranteed under the Constitution of the United States. His passion is problem solving. He approaches each medical negligence case as a scientist and as a lawyer trying to solve a puzzle. And because he's seen many patients suffer needless pain and injury, he makes it his dedicated mission to get legitimate, truthful answers to tough questions and issues, which result in hospitals and doctors being more responsible to patients and society. These successes drive him to help more people who have been harmed by incompetent and negligent doctors. His goal? To make medicine safer and more accountable. Victor has built a substantial reputation by consistently winning cases other law firms have turned down. His amazing courtroom skills and headline-grabbing success rate continue to provide his clients with the results they need and the results they deserve. This is the Insider Exclusive, live from White Oak, Pennsylvania.
It is my great pleasure to introduce Victor Pribanic to the show. Welcome to the show, Victor.
Thank you, Steve.
Tell our audience a little bit about your firm, what type of law you practice.
We represent people that have been injured by hospitals, doctors, products, other individuals, always the ordinary person, the little guy, if you will, who has had a bad life-changing experience because of someone else's conduct.
And these cases can involve automobile accidents, personal injury, that sort of thing, correct?
Yes.
Product defect cases.
Right, all of those.
I'd like to point out to our audience that from the trial lawyer's perspective, your perspective, you really have to evaluate a case very carefully, because if you don't win the case, you don't make any money, correct?
Correct.
So what you have to look at is whether it's a viable case. What is a viable case?
A viable case is one that they always have to have serious injuries or death involved, and one that you believe in, and one that you have some prospect for succeeding in. To be sure, I think many of us take cases that are hard cases, that are challenging cases, because it's the right thing to do. We know we're on the right side. Doesn't mean it's going to be an easy battle, but if you see somebody who's been harmed by something and side with them, even though it's difficult, you can proceed with it.
Do you feel that when you pick the right side and you're fighting for justice, that your jury is going to be able to see that too?
I think they sense that. There's nothing phony about, or shouldn't be anything phony about a courtroom. When you get into a courtroom, you must care about your client. You must care about what happens to them. And if you really feel that way, and you really feel that know that you're on the right side of the case, I think jurors sense that, and it has an impact on the trial.
Today we have another medical malpractice case that we're going to be talking about, Miss Waheed.
Saria Waheed.
Yes. Yeah. Tell our audience about who she was and what happened to her.
Saria was a woman from who had come to America from Pakistan in her mid-60s, who had a lovely family, husband Abdul, great people, who had a routine urological procedure. Saria was a diabetic for years, well-controlled, meticulous, well-disciplined diabetic, but was a diabetic, who had a surgery that resulted in her becoming infected, which can happen even in the best of hands, but the infection was then not addressed promptly and not diagnosed promptly, and she became a victim, what's known as urosepsis, very, very lethal condition where your urine becomes infected and the whole body begins to shut down, and the peripheral vascular system, the veins and arteries in your legs and your feet begin to shut down. And as a result of that, Saria lost both of her legs below her knees and most of her fingers on both hands.
Now, what period of time did this take place after her operation, that she had her her legs amputated?
It was a long course with her in respect to whether and how much of her limbs were going to be lost as a result of sepsis. Basically what happens is the body is trying to save itself, and it shuts off blood to the extremities,
right,
and they die off, just like if you tied off the vessels with a string. And Saria spent months in the hospital.
Now, her son is a doctor, isn't he? A cardiologist?
Yes, he is. Adele is a cardiologist here in Pittsburgh.
And I understand he played a major part in determining that medical malpractice had been committed here. Is that right?
He did.
And how did he do this?
I recall Adele testifying at this case that he was in New York City, lives here in Pittsburgh. He's an interventional cardiologist. When he came back to see his mom, he became concerned because she'd had this routine procedure that didn't seem to have gone quite right afterwards. And when he arrived at the hospital, he described seeing his mom in fulminant or raging sepsis, which is an extreme
Which would have been noticeable to anybody else in the hospital.
Ought to have been. And that's why there was a case, because the urological surgeon who had cared for her, it was our contention, ought to have diagnosed it and addressed it much more promptly than it was.
What were the challenges of this case? Because you have a son who's a young doctor.
Yes.
You have a urologist at this hospital who's probably pretty experienced,
yes,
maybe respected, right? So technically you might have a difference of opinion, and yet he sees his mother, who is in full-blown sepsis, correct?
Right.
And he's wondering, why doesn't the other hospital staff see this, and why aren't they doing anything about it?
Right.
What are the challenges in pursuing a case like this?
Well, like any medical case, as you correctly discerned, the argument is, well, this is an issue of matter of judgment. Diagnoses of infections are sometimes difficult to make, and this one ultimately we thought it was not difficult to make. And this case they were renowned urological surgeons brought in by the defense from around the country to testify that this was everything that the defendant did in this case had been done just so and just right and just properly, and it was just one of those unfortunate things because she was a diabetic and so forth that she ended up where she did.
And then it comes down to a jury. You settled this case, right?
Moments, literally a moment or two before the closing argument after a week-long trial was to occur.
Mm-hmm. We can't talk about what the settlement was,
right?
But why do you think the other side settled?
I expect because it was their expectation they were going to lose the case, and obviously with the dramatic injuries that Saria suffered, and that they settle cases because of
they're afraid of what the verdict might be.
Yeah. Yes. Absolutely.
How is Saria doing today?
She's well. She's begun a foundation for people who have lost limbs.
Wow.
Goes around the country preaching to others to make life easier for the many people in America who have suffered the loss of a limb. And really delightful person, and a wonderful cook too. I've been to their home prior to their trial many times, and enjoyed some great evenings with Saria and Abdul, getting to know them before her case.
When I originally brought up the fact that her son was a doctor, and he came to see her and he said, "Hey, something's wrong." How do you know when you're in the hospital or after an operation? How do you know if something might be going wrong? Should you seek another opinion and not necessarily the doctor that you went and saw?
That's a good question. Today, people in hospitals need to have somebody to look out for them in addition to the medical staff to make sure the medical staff does it, I think. But I would say, anytime you see something that you think is going wrong, you should bring it to the attention of the nurse.
Medical malpractice cases in America are kind of difficult to prove. Every state has their threshold that you have to meet to pursue them. How do you evaluate a medical malpractice injury?
The injury has to be bad enough to justify spending the time and money and the enormous effort that's required to get one of these cases to trial. Every single one of them is difficult. Any single one of those cases you try is a challenge to win because there's a resistance level. The judge tells the jury in a medical malpractice case, Steve, that the burden of proof on us, the plaintiff, is by a preponderance of the evidence or proof beyond a reasonable doubt, just tip the scales a little bit. In reality, I think it's more like proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Like in a criminal case, you almost have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the hospital, doctor, nurse, whomever, was negligent before you can win one of these cases. Really, I think the most difficult cases to try today.
No, I think you mentioned before we started the show that this was a very challenging case.
It was, indeed.
And why was that?
Sad to say, but cultural issues make a difference in America. Saria, as I told you, is a Pakistani woman, and her case was brought to trial in the midst of a turmoil that's still ongoing in the Middle East, and there was then a certain amount of post-9/11 resentment to Middle Eastern people that I was concerned about, but confident that the jurors would look past that, which I'm sure they did, and I'm sure the defendants realized they did.
Are there different types of medical malpractice cases?
Yes.
And what types are there?
Well, the most common are medication errors. You have people have the wrong surgeries. You have nursing mistakes where nurses give the wrong medicine, and failure to diagnose things is a very, very common, probably the most common issue in medical cases today.
When you evaluate any medical malpractice case, you have to gather together the evidence to, like you mentioned before, and see what do the records show. Do you find difficulty getting sometimes the records?
From hospitals, usually not. From individual physicians, especially those who think they might be culpable, sometimes the patients will try to get the records and they'll resist, the doctors that is. And sometimes they do try to play hide the ball. And we run into cases, unfortunately, a good many of them, where records we can prove have been changed by doctors and others between the time of the event and between the time suspicion is aroused, in a way that favors the doctor.
What happens to the doctors who falsify, and I'm going to use that, that's the right word to use.
It is the right word.
To falsify records so that it puts them in a better light. What happens to them in terms of their license, in terms of discipline by their profession? Anything?
In Pennsylvania, doctors who change records after the fact without dating it and initialing it are supposed to be subject to the loss of or suspension of a license, of their medical license. I've never known it to happen.
Do you find that, we hear a lot about frivolous lawsuits filed against doctors?
Right.
Is that true?
It's absolute nonsense.
Okay, because I do want to point out, if a lawyer files a frivolous lawsuit, what does a judge do?
It gets thrown out.
And what else?
And then the lawyer could be sanctioned for filing such a case.
And sanction means you get a fine.
Yeah.
And it could be substantial, right?
Yeah. In our state, you can't file a medical malpractice case unless you have a written opinion from a doctor saying that there's a reasonable basis to believe that that hospital, nurse, doctor, whomever, was negligent and harmed this patient.
Is that difficult to get that kind of statement from a doctor?
In the right case, no. I mean, in the right case, it's clear, and there are honest, good doctors around the country, not people that will just say what you want, who look at it objectively and say, this should not have happened to this patient.
Do you believe that as a result of winning some of these medical malpractice cases, that medicine and doctors and hospitals become more accountable, that they pay attention to their patients more? Do you think things get better?
There's no doubt that they do. I've seen institutions change policies. That's been part of settlements that I've been engaged in with hospital. There is no doubt that every one of these cases, and many of our clients bring these cases not for money, not for anything, but they say time and again, I don't want to see this happen to someone else.
Yeah, I think that's important, and I'm very glad that you are on our show today to present this case, because people need to be aware that just because a person wears a white coat doesn't mean what they say or what they do is absolutely right, right?
That's true.
Thank you very much for being on our show,
Thank you.
Victor.
Thanks for joining us. You can get more information about our guest and the issues at insiderexclusive.com.